Now, one of the things that comes along with this, which is one of the things that I love the most, when you boot up your old games, with the exception only of games that are hard capped at like 30 frames per second, for example, and don't have any sort of workaround, if you get upgraded hardware, your game is going to run better, it's going to look better, and of course there's a whole lot of ways that you can even expand it even further between mods and so on and so forth, but we'll talk more about that a bit later. The fact remains, though, you are rarely, almost never, in a position where you have to wait on the developer to update the game so that you can play it at a higher frame rate, with higher fidelity, any of those things. When you get an upgraded computer, whether you choose to upgrade it yourself, whether you buy a new one, if you have something that's more powerful than your previous computer, you pull out that game, you're going to be able to play it at better frame rates, at better resolution, and even if the game is hard capped, sometimes there is a way to work around that, whether through a mod or something else, and that makes it possible for you to actually be able to play the game at a better frame rate, better resolution, without having to wait on the developer to do that, or having to wait for a remaster, which is also something that is just immensely helpful. Because I can tell you that there are numerous games that I bought when I first started more heavily gaming on PC, even when I was still very heavily in console at the same time, back in 2010. Games that I bought back then that I could run at maybe 30 frames per second at best, sometimes dipping below that on my laptop. Those same games I could run today. I'd be able to run it 1440p, which is the resolution of my monitor, 240 frames per second with no issues whatsoever, all because of the fact that the way that the PC games are ported or made for the PC are built in such a way that you don't have to deal with these hard frame caps in most cases. That's not to say it never happens, because it does happen. FromSoft games are notorious for being locked to 60 frames per second as the maximum, and same thing with some Square Enix games, but the reality is that even those, you can actually work around to get higher frame rates. You know, one of the things that has been a frustration point for me when it comes to consoles, and one of the main reasons why I've all but left them behind, is when I get a game that is backwards compatible on the new hardware for a console. You know, like, for example, playing a game that was on PS4 and wanting to play it on PS5. There was a time when I was very seriously considering grabbing a PS5, because at the time they were still hard to get, and I got the email saying, hey, you can get it, you can order it from the store now. I almost grabbed it. The game I was thinking of playing, because I hadn't finished it yet on PS4, was Persona 5 Royal. But then I found out it's still stuck at 30 FPS, even on the PS5, even though the PS5 is a lot more powerful than the PS4.
The crap is this?
And that just made me decide I'm not getting a PS5 because I'm tired of this nonsense. And that's something you don't have to deal with PC. Except, like I said, in the rare occasion of games that are locked to 30 FPS. You know, games like Okami HD, for example, or Shenmue, or Final Fantasy X. But even with those games, a lot of times you can find ways to get around that a little bit, whether it's through a mod, or potentially through something like lossless scaling, which I've heard is pretty good, but I'm also not really a fan of frame gen, so I have to try it out and see whether or not it's actually something that is worth doing on games like that. But I still have the choice. And, you know, like, something else that happened fairly recently, I had bought Triangle Strategy and Octopath Traveler 2 basically right at launch when they came out for the Switch. Because I loved Octopath Traveler, I loved the style, I loved the music, I loved the combat. But when it came to these games, I just never got around to either one of them. I wanted to play Triangle Strategy before I jumped into Octopath 2, and I never got around to it. So my Switch 2 comes up. I'm planning to try and play these games, but not only do I have a lower quality screen overall because it's not OLED and I like the OLED better, but because it's higher resolution and the game hasn't been updated, I'm stuck at 30 FPS with blurry visuals. So it's rendering at 720p on a 1080p screen at 30 FPS or lower, probably just 30 FPS locked. And I just really did not like that. It was bothering me to the point where I just looked to see if I could find discounted versions of both games for Steam, and I bought the discounted versions. I paid a third of the price for each of those games on Steam, and they run at double the frame rate, have different visual options. I can get rid of motion blur because I hate motion blur. I can do 60 FPS locked. With Octopath Traveler 2, I could technically do better, but because it was kind of inconsistent with the visual settings I wanted, I just locked it at 60. And then I had so much better of an experience. Or a game like, for example, the Somnium Files. I had bought it on Switch years ago, hadn't really gotten around to it, but I finally got around to playing it this year after I got it on Steam. And I played the first game on my Steam Deck at a locked 90 frames per second, which, it shouldn't be a demanding game. It's a visual novel. It doesn't really matter. But then, because the second game was not a good enough price on Steam, and it was like $8 on Switch, I went ahead and grabbed the second game on Switch, and it was like 30 and sub 30 FPS, and it was really hard to play. I didn't understand why it was so bad to me, and it was just because I had gotten so used to playing the previous game at 90 that when I tried to play the new game at 30, it just wasn't working for me. And so I ended up putting it down, and then there was a discount on the Steam version, and I grabbed it there and locked 90 FPS again. So this is something that you get with PC that is immensely helpful. It makes the game purchases feel like that much more worth it, because you don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to play it on the new hardware, or whether it's going to play as well, because the reality is not only is it going to play better on the new hardware, it's going to look better. It's just going to be a better experience all across the board. And if you buy a game and then years later you still haven't played it, you can play it on your new hardware and you're going to get an even better experience. A clear illustrative point. So I have this old laptop that I purchased in 2010. The mobile graphics card was produced early 2010. The CPU, which is an Intel i7, I don't even remember what model it is, but it was produced back in 2009. So it is an old laptop. This thing is older than my oldest kid, who's turning 10 this year. And there are games that I bought back then, that I bought when I first got my laptop, or, within that time frame when I was using it, which was basically up until early 2016. Games that I bought back then, I can still play today at better visuals, better performance than I could back then. As an illustrative point, I actually recorded stuff from my old laptop. I connected it through my capture card, because of the fact that laptop, there's no way I could record and play something at the same time. So I captured, first of all, a game that I actually played on my laptop, which was the 2013 version of Tomb Raider. Now, in this case, it's the definitive edition, the GOG version. So I recorded the benchmark on first my laptop. You'll notice that the frame rate was in the 20 to 30 range. I played through the entire game that way back in 2014. Then I also ran that same benchmark on my PC build from 2016. As I either have mentioned or will mention, depending on how I arrange things, you can repurpose old parts in order to build a secondary PC. So I took my old parts, which is in a secondary PC that we have in our guest room. I recorded that same benchmark on there, and there I was getting pretty much a locked 75 frames per second, right around there, which is the maximum refresh rate of that monitor. And keep in mind, the hardware I have on that computer is old. Was old when I got it in 2016. It was pretty mid to low range, using a GTX 980, which I'll put the manufacturer year for that probably up here in the video. And then it had an i5 6500K, I believe is what it was. So it was pretty old parts, 32 gigs of RAM, but it was outdated at the time, and it still runs the game very well. Now, when you look at on my current hardware running that same game, I'm getting well over 100 frames per second on hardware that, while the CPU is fairly new, I think it was just a year or two old. The GPU is an RTX 2080 Ti, which was manufactured back in 2018. So there's a big difference in terms of that. And you can see the difference in how, both from a frame rate standpoint and a visual standpoint, the game improves. Now, granted, this is a pretty old game, so visually it's not the most impressive. But then we look at a game that's a more extreme example. Now, like I said, I was using this old laptop from 2010 when I got it, which was October of 2010, up through January of 2016. There was a game that came out during that time that laptop just could not run. It couldn't run it, period. And I didn't buy this game at that time, but if I had bought the game at the time, it would have been... it was unplayable. And so at the time, I bought the game on PS4, and that's Batman Arkham Knight. Now, I ran the benchmark on this. I installed the GOG version of Arkham Knight so I could demonstrate this. Running at the lowest settings, the average FPS that I was getting was 15 frames per second, and that is with a ton of graphical glitches, all sorts of problems, things like that. Now, I did not try running this back then. I knew that the laptop could not run the game. So it was miserable. I mean, it would have been miserable trying to run it back then. But I could have still purchased it back then if I wanted to. And then, as I upgraded my hardware, it would get better. So the thing is that while you have it stuck at 30 frames per second on the PS4, the PS5, and even the PS5 Pro, each time I upgraded my hardware, the game looks and runs way better. I went from running it at the lowest of low settings and getting an average of 15 frames per second, which, as far as I'm concerned, is unplayable, to my 2016 build, where I'm getting almost a consistent 60 frames per second at much higher settings at 1080p. And then when I go to my current build at 1440p, which is significantly higher pixel count than 1080p, keep that in mind. All settings maxed out, all NVIDIA effects active. The only thing I did was, like I usually do, I always turn off motion blur and film grain and chromatic aberration, because I just don't like those effects. And I'm getting well over 100 frames per second average, sometimes going up into the 130s and 140s. That's something that does not happen on consoles. The fact that you have the PS5 Pro today, and once again, I'm not ragging on the PS5 Pro. This is a software issue. This is not a hardware issue. But my point is, this clearly illustrates that upgrading your hardware means your games will look and run better. With Batman Arkham Knight, the fact that it is not limited to 30 frames per second on PC means that when you have better hardware, you are going to get a better experience, because it's going to run better, it's going to look better. You can do this is with no mods whatsoever. I should look into mods, see if I can find some good ones, because I know that there are tons of mods, and this game can look like, seriously, even better than it already does. And it is a great looking game. It runs great, it plays great, it's fantastic. That is one of the things that I love probably the most about PC games. And there are a whole bunch of other games that I could have tested out as well. Both games that I ran originally on my laptop versus new games that just straight up couldn't run back then. But the fact of the matter remains, if I bought a game today that for some reason didn't run on my computer, games that are just incredibly poorly optimized, just don't run well. Now, I don't think that there's anything that would run it below 30 frames per second on my computer, even though my computer is nowhere near top of the line. But even if there was something like that, if I tried to play it down the line on my upgraded hardware, I would still be able to, and I wouldn't have to wait on the developer to make it possible for me to run it at a better frame rate.